Imagine that you wake up tomorrow to find that you are being ruled by the following sort of government. You have been assigned a superior who can exert arbitrary control over you, restricting your movements, what you wear, what topics you can discuss publicly in your free time, and what activities you engage in during your day. Your superior is not accountable to you in any way. You didn't vote for her, you have no ability to remove her, and if you complain to her superiors about the way she treats you, the most likely outcome is that you will be permanently exiled. Moreover, you are living under conditions of constant surveillance. The contents of your emails and social media accounts are read by your superior or her superiors and monitored for speech that runs contrary to the organizational philosophy of the government. Your sexual expression and choice of sexual partners are both limited by the government, and all economic activity is organized by a centralized planning committee run by a person who established herself as the dictator. Now, I want you to ask yourself a really important question, and then pause the video while you search for the answer. The question is this: in the scenario I just described, are you free? Now, when I ask myself this question, the answer that I get is really clear, and the answer is no. A government like that is a communist dictatorship. Such a government seems completely opposed to freedom, liberty, or any similar concept. Now, it would be nice if the question I just asked were just an abstract academic thought experiment that we could consider from the armchair and then never have to wrestle with in our lived experiences. But unfortunately, the modern workplace in the United States looks a lot like that. And it's just that we often don't realize that we are in this position because we don't often consider just how much power the corporations we work for have over us. We forget that we can be fired for our social media posts, for many kinds of lawful political activities, for our use of recreational drugs, or for no reason at all. That's what happens when you have employment at will. Now, this lecture is my second lecture of 3 lectures based on Elizabeth Anderson's 2015 Tanner lectures, and there's a link to that in the description. And in what follows, I'm going to present her analysis of these miniature communist dictatorships in our midst that many of us find that we are governed by for most of our lives. Now, so far I've been a little bit vague, and let's be a little bit more specific about the kinds of government that Anderson is describing. So first of all, the term government is broader than simply state governments. According to Anderson, government exists wherever some have the authority to issue orders backed by sanctions in one or more domains of life. That's from page 42 of her book, Private Government. In patriarchal societies where wives are forced to be obedient to husbands, husbands exercise government over wives. In societies where slavery exists, masters exercise government over slaves. Now, not all government is bad. A school, a classroom, where teachers exercise, they give instructions to students backed by sanctions, like failing grades or whatever, that counts as a government as well. So when Anderson says that corporations are governments, she's not drawing an analogy between corporations and state governments. What she's saying instead is that they literally are governments because they literally are institutions in which some have the authority to issue orders to others backed by sanctions. Now, Anderson distinguishes between 2 kinds of governments. He distinguishes between private and public governments. And I'm going to give you a quotation now from page 45 of her book, which really illustrates what a private government is. So she goes, "You are subject to private government wherever, 1, you are subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you for not complying over some domain of your life, and 2, the authority is treated as none of your business across a wide range of cases what orders it issues or why it sanctions you. A government is private with respect to a subject if it can issue orders backed by sanctions to that subject in some domain of that subject's life, and that subject has no say in how the government operates, and no standing to determine that their interests be taken into account, other than, perhaps, in narrowly defined circumstances, in the decisions the government makes. Private government is government that has arbitrary, unaccountable power over those it governs. This, of course, is a matter of degree. So that was page 45 of private government. Now, in contrast, a public government is a government where the orders and sanctions you are given are treated as your business. In the United States, for instance, most citizens above the age of 18 are allowed to vote for their rulers, vote directly for policies through referendums, and, in a narrow range of cases, request access to government documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. These features make the United States government more of a public government than a government without voting, a Freedom of Information Act, and the ability to pose and vote on referendums. However, when you put yourself in the shoes of a convicted felon, it's clear that the United States isn't completely public. And this is why it's so important to understand that the private-public spectrum has degrees. Now, what should be clear is that the private-public distinction is not a distinction between state governments and governments that exist outside the state. This is a crucial point that you need to understand. A state government can be more private than a non-state government. The relationship between a government and a state is absolutely irrelevant to whether the government is public or private in Anderson's sense of private government. The only thing that matters is whether subordinates are dominated by rulers who exercise arbitrary and unaccountable power over them. So at the beginning of this lecture, I described a government and asked you to consider whether you would be free if you were ruled by it. My answer, and I imagine yours too, was no. I want to explore this question in greater detail now, though. And to do that, we're going to need to distinguish between three different notions of freedom. These are negative, positive, and Republican. So let's discuss these in turn. If you have negative freedom, nobody is currently interfering with your actions. For example, a person living on a deserted island has perfect negative freedom because, in virtue of the islands being deserted, there's nobody to interfere with their freedom. Negative freedom means very little, though, if the number of potential actions in your option set is extremely limited. So the person on the deserted island, for example, has exactly this problem. Although they have perfect negative freedom, their options are so limited. They can look for water, they can look for food, they can sleep, but it's not like they can write symphonies, pursue friendships, or travel. Now, Republican freedom is freedom from being subject to the arbitrary and unaccountable will of others. And the person on the deserted island has perfect Republican freedom as well as perfect negative freedom because he's not subject to anyone's will at all. He's completely alone. But another example can help us illustrate the difference between negative and Republican freedom. So let's talk about that one. Imagine that right now you are the subject of a benevolent king. And right now the king gives you a rich menu of options to choose from in every single aspect of your life. You want a new computer, you get the new computer. You want some new friends, you get new friends. And the king doesn't interfere with your projects at all. But you're not completely free. And the reason why is because the king can take away all those things if he chooses to do so. Even though he is, for the moment, choosing to not exercise his power, he does have the ability to exercise arbitrary and unaccountable power over you, to throw you in dungeons or to have you exiled or killed. What you lack is Republican freedom. Now, we often make trade-offs between these different kinds of freedom. So, for example, let's talk about private property. Having private property involves a trade-off between negative freedom and positive freedom. So imagine a world without private property, where anyone can take or compete for any good. A world like that would contain significant negative freedom, since nobody would constrain your pursuit of the goods you want. But it would also be disastrous for positive freedom. And the reason why it would be disastrous is that people would no longer have an incentive to produce goods that they could then sell in a marketplace, because people who wanted the goods could simply steal them. For this reason, we accept a limitation on our negative freedom by enforcing property rights in order to provide people with the greater positive freedom. And this is a trade-off that I think is worth making, and I'm guessing that most people watching this do as well. So at this point, let's go back to the example of the private government from the beginning. I described a workplace where you had significant limitations on your positive, negative, and Republican freedom. There were limitations on what you could do. Your rich menu of options was limited, and there was a boss who, even if she was being nice to you now, could at any point just fire you on a whim. Moreover, these limitations characterize many modern workplaces. It's not just the one that I talked about. In lots of workplaces, workers are fired for their Facebook posts, for their sexual activities, for the choice of partners, and they can be even penalized for failing to comply with company-mandated wellness programs. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about a couple of more horror stories, but I'm going to leave it a little bit vague for now. And what I want to point to is this question of why are such limitations on freedom tolerated? So an important part of this answer is something called the theory of the firm. Many companies are subject to economies of scale. And what this means, roughly, is that large companies are more efficient than smaller companies that produce the same goods. For example, a large manufacturing company with a huge concentration of capital can purchase an injection molding machine that can be used to produce a lot of plastic units at a fast pace for a low price. A smaller company, without the capital necessary to purchase, operate, and maintain an injection molding equipment, might have to build units by hand, and that's vastly going to increase the cost per unit and decrease the speed of production. There's more factors too. So, think about the efficiency of a hierarchical organization. So imagine two potential manufacturing companies. In firm A, you have this network of private contractors who specialize in different steps of manufacturing process. And they're always negotiating contracts with one another, and because they're kind of scheming, they don't always give each other all the information because they want to try to get a good contract. And that's going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies and delays while the contractors are trying to improve their bargaining positions. In firm B, things are very different. The network of contractors has been replaced with a centralized hierarchical firm in which bosses determine corporate objectives and pass along instructions to assembly line workers. A lot less time is wasted in the negotiation of contracts, and thus the whole enterprise is a lot more efficient. So the theory of the firm explains why large hierarchical firms exist. It explains why we get the large firms with the large concentrations of capital, and it explains why we have firms that are arranged hierarchically rather than having a more flat relationship between a bunch of different independent contractors. But here's what it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain, it doesn't give us a full justification for the serious restrictions on freedom that exist today. It's not as if what you post on Facebook is going to have an effect on how well you do on the assembly line. So the question I'm going to propose in the next lecture and discuss is, how might a defender of the modern firm respond to this charge? And do these responses succeed? All right. Thank you.